Introducing the Arius technology elevated print. With this style of reproduction, it's possible to showcase a painting's textured surface or introduce texture to a graphic artwork and photographs. An elevated print from the Arius process is similar in result to the low relief effect you see on coins. However, the effect possible with our process is much more dynamic, in that we can substantially raise the level of the surface in addition to adding color. Coins are a good example of low relief, and even with a subtle elevation, it's effective. And the same is true with elevated prints. More isn't always better. Keep this in mind when considering how elevated you wish to go with your projects. When generating an Arius elevated print, you can think of the effect as an update to low relief sculpture. This line would likely work well for a print, but it was physically sculpted in stone, with sculpting rules as the only barrier to its creation. The Arius elevated 3D print is not carved out of a solid material. It's an additive process created in layers, so the previous layer is the foundation for each additional layer to come. And this is a key factor to remember with elevated prints, as it's not possible to print undercuts. You can't make them in a 2D Photoshop image, but it can happen with 3D sculpting tools. Any undercut area will print out as a high contrast edge, which will become a dark wall in an elevated print. To avoid unwanted walls, create a softer blend in the grayscale from a dark high point to a light low point. Where the coin is subtle in its elevation, an Egyptian wall relief almost feels inflated by comparison while still retaining fine detail, but it's a better analogy to what's achievable with an Arius print. The sculpted stone here is clear to see due to the light direction and shadow, and this amount of volume effect is easily possible with an Arius print. Remember too to follow the Egyptian style with no undercuts. In this elevated print, a 2D photograph has been elevated in the same manner as the original sculpted stone. Even printed at 2 mm, the effect is dynamic, and an example that going to a max of 5 mm is not necessarily needed. As you can see, the elevated print has the original lighting and shadow of the photograph printed on the surface, with additional shadows and highlights from the room also affecting the surface. This is something to keep in mind when considering which image to elevate. Lighting effects in the design may compete with the room lighting effects when viewing the dimensional print. Taking this into consideration can be beneficial or used to effect. With these figures, you have narrow tube-like areas, which when elevated to 2 mm, at smaller overall dimensions like 15 by 25 centimeters, appear hemispherical. But if we take a large subject in the image and elevate it, even 5 mm, with the same print dimensions, the effect will seem much less obvious. It's all about square centimeters working within the limits of 5 mm of elevation. If possible, exaggerating the internal contrast between large areas will help the overall volume effect, like this large bump at this arrow and the recessed area here. Focus on these areas rather than the whole rock overall. The face in this painting was developed with paint dripped onto a canvas, which works well for an elevated print. It's a large surface area to elevate, but each individual drip of paint is an elevated tube that collectively adds to the effect. This was printed at 242 by 254 mm, or 9 by 10 inches. The glass dome of the vase here is 112 mm across, and was elevated 4 mm at the center. As you can see, the effect is there, but it's not as effective as here with the Egyptian figures. This face is also a good example on the subject of transparency. All elevated print inks are opaque and will not convey any transparent or translucent qualities when viewing the print. In this case, the lack of refraction might be distracting when the viewer removes and expects a refractive change. Keep this in mind if your image has water, crystal, or sculpted glass imagery. Also note that there are no metallic inks available. The scan of traditional brushstrokes reveals an intricate web of fine ridges, most between 1 and 2 mm. Even at this low elevation, it's clearly effective, so be open to not going to the highest level with everything. The same is true with photography. In this example, the brick details are subtle but effective. There's a base layer of gradients to generate bulk volume, and then where appropriate, the desaturated color photograph layer is applied on top with the transparency set to 10%. For the bricks, the grayscale tone value of the lighter grout, roughly 130, averages 60 units brighter compared to the dark brick gray value at 75. So that layer is set to 10%, which gives the additional level of indentation and elevation to the bricks. The height of each brick in a print is roughly 1/4 millimeter, or half the diameter of a mechanical pencil lead. For a more in-depth look at the processes, procedures, and expectations in elevated prints, check out the rest of the video series on this Arius channel.